Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever time it is that you inky savages are joining me for another PenBoyRoy fountain pen review channel video. In the year 2020, the Jaffa brands, and if you don't know who they are the company that owns both Monteverde and Conklin. They transitioned all of their nibs from what they were using to German-made Jowo nibs. German-made Jowo nibs have a reputation of being solid nibs. So they did that for all their nibs, from extra fine down to double broad, to even the Omniflex nib. Now, there was some controversy last year. I think I might have made a lot of noise about a new, quote-unquote, new Omniflex nib. This time for real. The new Omniflex nib made by the Jowo brand is in fact new. Now, what I want to do in this video is I want to give you guys some comparisons and a writing sample of both nibs just to see what the differences are between the two, but we're first going to start with the physical differences. Now, this right here on the Conklin Durograph Freedom Pen is the old version of the Omniflex nib. If you take a look at it, it has that heart-shaped hole that we're familiar with the Omniflex nibs of old. It's branded, it says Flex, it has a Conklin logo, and Toledo, USA, the location of where the original Conklin brand was established. We have the cheapy plastic feed. Okay, now let's compare that to our new Jowo Omniflex. Notice the scallops cut out in the side are slightly different. I'm going to bring up the other one. So this is the old one on my right, on your right, on whoever's right. Everybody's doing the same thing. Compare the scallops. The scallops cut out on the old are a little bit wider as opposed to on the new. Also, take a look at the new one. If you look at the new one, do you see the shoulder scroll work? That is just typical for Jowo nib. So what they did is they took a steel Jowo nib and they cut out those scallops. They both have the cheapy plastic feed. Okay? So those are really just the physical differences. I also want to say that Jowo nibs in general, if you look at the side, they have more of a more of a curved shape, contoured shape to the nib. So the cheapy plastic feed is completely straight. So I think that curved shape of the nib might actually behoove the nib's performance, as ink will actually pull up more between the straight edge of the cheapy plastic feed and the curve of the Omniflex nib. Okay. Now, I was talking about the branding on the old on my right here. Let me talk about the branding of the new. If you take a look at it, all it says is Omniflex. It doesn't say Conklin. It doesn't say Monteverde, nothing. And the reason why is, as I said, Monteverde and Conklin are both owned by Jaffa brands. So what Jaffa brands decided to do, and I think it's actually a good idea, is they just branded it Omniflex so that way the nibs can be interchangeable on either brand that they own. And that way it won't drive OCD people like me crazy with having a Conklin branded nib on a Monteverde pen, which that I can't do just because my OCD kicks in and drives me absolutely insane. So those are the physical differences between the two nibs. I'm going to show you a writing sample of the two, and I'll describe how it feels to write with, and then you can decide which one you think is better. So I'm going to start here with my Monteverde Giant Sequoia, and this one is equipped with the Jowo Omniflex nib, the new one, the 2021 edition, or 2020. I got it in 2021. You know what? We're calling it 2021 from now on because that's when I got it. Anyway, I'm finding that it takes a moderate amount of pressure in order to get the line variation. I'm also finding that the writing experience is a very wet one. Now, it's not unreasonable wet, but it makes me feel like the feed is fully saturated and I have no fear of railroading or ink starvation from happening. So, as you can see, there's a lot of shading in this ink. This ink, by the way, is Iced Cookie by Monteverde. I'm going to switch over to the Conklin Durograph Freedom. Now remember, this is the old Omniflex nib. Okay, so what I'm finding here is we're getting a little bit more degree of shading. So that says to me that it's not as, or rather the feed is not as saturated or flooded. But what we do have here are two things. One, it takes a little bit less pressure to get the line variation, and two, I'm finding that there's a greater ratio of line variation between the non-flexed and the flexed writing. So The thinner lines are thinner and it goes out to a thicker line, so it shows a little bit more line variation. Now, as you can see, we're getting some railroading because I think that the feed is being drained of the ink that it was flooded with. I'm going to go back to the Monteverde with the new Jowo Omniflex, and let's take a look here. It's still wet. The feed is still flooded. And I think it really has to do with the fact that there is a little bit more of an ink reservoir trapped underneath the contour of the Jowo nib and the straight surface of the feed beneath it. So what I'm finding is that there is no railroading, there's no ink starvation with this Jowo Omniflex nib. And I'll take it. I'm actually enjoying the fact that I don't have to worry about it starving, running out of ink, or railroading. So I'm going to resort to swirls because it seems like when in doubt, always resort to the swirls. And what I want to see is how long it takes before the feed that is saturated with ink drains out. So I'm going to keep doing this. And what I'm finding is, and I like it, there's not any ink starvation. It just keeps going. Now, the writing experience, just so you know, it just feels like a Jowo nib. If you have any familiarity with Jowo nibs, it's a Jowo nib, a Jowo steel nib. It just gives you more line variation. Now, let's go to the old Omniflex. All right, so we already have some railroading, and that's probably because I expended the ink that was in the feed, and we need to give it more time to flood again. So I don't think that the old Omniflex nibs were bad. I just think that you got to know its temperament. You have to know that it takes a little bit more time to flood the feed. You have to go a little slower. As you can see, there's a lot of railroading because I'm writing the same with both. And I think that between the two, the Jowo definitely has its benefits. And I think the benefits outweigh the negatives. I would say that the negatives would be that there's less degree of line variation with the Jowo Omniflex, but I think it clearly makes up for that with its feed saturation, the ability to keep up with the ink needs, whereas the old has its benefits as well. It gives you a little bit more line variation, requires a little bit less pressure, but the caveat is the feed starves a little quicker. So that's my overview on the two nibs. If you ask me which one I prefer the Jowo. The writing experience, normal writing, I find it to be a little better. But most importantly, I find that the Jowo Omniflex is able to keep up with the line variation and the ink required relative to that of the old Omniflex. So there you have it. Well, thanks again for watching. Love you guys. Be well, be safe.